Okay, hello everybody. So firstly, I'd like to thank the Sound Environment Centre, and in particular Phil and Sane for inviting me to speak to you today, and for all of you coming. I'm very excited to be here. It's my first time in Lund. Okay, so what I want to do this afternoon is present some of my ongoing work on environmental and wildlife sound archives. In this talk, I'll be discussing 3 archives that I've conducted some research on. So firstly, the World Soundscape Project's archive at Simon Fraser University. Secondly, the British Library's Wildlife and Environmental Sounds collection. And thirdly, the Animal Sound Archive at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. What I will do is I'll present some work that I've been doing based on archival research, which encompasses sound recordings and their metadata, written documents, correspondence between recordists and archivists, photographs and other ephemera, as well as interviews with key people who work at all of these 3 archives. Now, at this juncture, I'd like to acknowledge that research conducted at the British Library and the Berlin Natural History Museum was funded by a British Academy and Leverhulme Small Research Grant, and that this work was carried out in collaboration with Dr. Sandra Jasper of Humboldt University, Berlin. Sandra has given me her enthusiastic blessing to present parts of our collaborative work in today's talk. So here's an overview of what I'd like to discuss today. I'll firstly introduce the 3 archives, where I will highlight the key actors involved in each of their development, before moving to outlining how the archives have addressed the challenge of maintaining their audio material so that it remains accessible to the public. The next section is the main focus of my talk. Now here I will discuss some of the ethical and political questions that listening to archived sonic environments raises. Lastly, I will demonstrate how the archives are grappling with contemporary environmental change, particularly biodiversity loss. Okay, so the first of the archives stems from a project that I'm sure some of you are aware of. Initiated in the late 1960s at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver by the composer R. Murray Schafer, the World Soundscape Project, or WSP for short, was a multifaceted research project that sought to document and analyze soundscapes, predominantly in Canada, but also parts of Western Europe. Now, the WSP undertook this work as a means of educating lay as well as professional audiences about sonic sensory perception through the production of LPs and CDs, radio programs, books, pamphlets, live performances, lecture tours, and teaching within the School of Communication at Simon Fraser, where the project participants were based. Through undertaking these activities, the project also laid much of the theoretical and methodological foundations of soundscape research. The influence of the WSP on sound studies cannot be overemphasized. Now, the WSP Sound Archive is primarily composed of 3 field recording projects. Firstly, recordings of Vancouver, produced between September 1972 and July 1973. This is the focus really of my own research, so I'll be discussing this component of the archive today. Secondly, recordings from a cross-Canada recording tour produced during October and November of 1973. And thirdly, recordings from a European recording tour produced between February and June of 1975. Now, the intention behind the Vancouver project was stated thusly by the participants. The project was, quote, a study to determine the characteristic features of the Vancouver soundscape, to draw attention to its sound marks, its sky sounds, bright or clouded sea sounds, calm or wind-blown waves, the sounds of mountains looming darkly or receding in haze, to distill these and other resonating clues into a sense of Vancouver place. I should note here that sound marks, one of the numerous terms coined by the group, are sounds that are considered in some way significant, be it culturally or ecologically, by a given community. One of the original members of the WSP, who joined as a research assistant in 1973, is Professor Barry Truax, and he now maintains the archive at Simon Fraser University, and this is an image of me visiting him and the collection back in 2018. The second sound archive is the Wildlife and Environmental Sounds collection at the British Library, which I'll refer to as the WES collection. Now, the WS is one component of the British Library's much larger sound archive, which totals somewhere around 6.5 million recordings of oral history, music, drama, speeches, ethnographic material, and so on and so forth. The WES collection is composed of approximately 220,000 wildlife and environmental sound recordings, but this only includes those recordings which have so far been catalogued. There are many thousands of recordings still to be processed, which is in the basement of the archive in London, and new recordings are being deposited within the library all the time. So this makes the collection the largest wildlife sound archive in Europe. In the early 1950s, a man by the name of Patrick Soule managed to secure some funding in a building in Russell Square owned by the British Museum to set up a library dedicated to audio recordings, and they called it the British Institute of Recorded Sound, which was open to the public as a registered educational charity in 1955. Now, the following year, the Institute started to publish the Bulletin of the British Institute of Recorded Sound, which was renamed Recorded Sound in 1961. This in-house journal, which has been a fantastic archival resource, discusses all things related to the preservation and study of audio recordings and provided updates about the expansion of the archive. Now, in 1969, under the auspices of Patrick Seller and Geoffrey Boswell, a dedicated wildlife sound collection called the British Library of Wildlife Sounds, or BLOWS for short, and I have to keep up, there's a lot of acronyms in this, was started. Patrick Seller was a prolific amateur wildlife recordist who worked as an electrical engineer, and Geoffrey Boswell was an acclaimed wildlife filmmaker and broadcaster based at the BBC's Natural History Unit in Bristol. While Geoffrey Boswell remained at the BBC, he was instrumental in growing the collection. He was an excellent sound recordist who understood the value of such recordings for scientific research, and he spent a considerable amount of his time nurturing an international network of recordists and scientific institutions to submit recordings and help sustain the collection. Now, the image of Patrick on the left is from 1970, when he won the European Broadcasting Union's wildlife tape recording competition with a recording of a leech's petrel, a species of seabird. And this is his winning entry. Now, BLOWS was set up with two primary functions. Firstly, it served as a central repository of wildlife recordings for bioacoustics research. Bioacoustics is a branch of biology that investigates the functional role of sound, particularly animal communication. Secondly, it served as a reference library for the identification of species, both for amateurs, particularly bird watchers, and professionals, such as scientific taxonomists. As a consequence, BLOWS has collected single species recordings, such as the one that I just played you, for most of its history. Some of these recordings were published as commercial releases, and so these examples here are from a series of 15 LP releases of bird songs published between the early 1970s and the 1980s, with recordings by Stuart Palmer, who worked for Radio Sweden, and Geoffrey Boswell himself. Now, in 1983, the Institute became part of the British Library and was renamed the National Sound Archive. And in 1997, the National Sound Archive moved into the new British Library building at St Pancras. BLOWS is now referred to as the Wildlife and Environmental Sounds Collection. And the current curator of the WES is Cheryl Tipp, whose responsibility is to oversee essentially every facet of the collection, from its expansion to fostering public access. Now, the third and final archive is the Animal Sound Archive, or ASA. This was founded in 1951 by the East German bioacoustician Professor Günther Tembrock at what was then the Zoological Institute of Humboldt University in East Berlin. The collection totals approximately 120,000 recordings, making it Europe's second largest wildlife sound archive. Now, Tembrock's recordings form the backbone of the ASA, predominantly recorded in Berlin, Brandenburg, and other parts of the German Democratic Republic. With German reunification, the collection grew considerably via ASA research projects and through donations and purchases of international collections. Now, since 1987, the archive has been managed by Dr. Karl-Heinz Frommelt, who is himself a noted bioacoustician, who is pictured here. Beginning in the late 1940s, Ten Broek developed a career as an ethologist, a subdiscipline of zoology concerned with animal behaviour. Ten Broek embraced sound recording technologies relatively early when, in October 1951, he recorded 2 captive tawny owls that were held at the Zoological Institute. Ten Broek dedicated significant research time to studying red fox behaviours, including their vocal communication between 1952 and 1966. Foxes were chosen as they were considered a model species for behavioural studies and, just as importantly, given the increasingly restrictive nature of the nascent GDR state, were relatively accessible wild animals within East Berlin. The significance of red foxes to the ASA is reflected in the archive's contemporary logo, pictured here at the bottom left, which foregrounds a Ten Broek sketch of 2 foxes. Now, as pictured top left, foxes were kept in an enclosure in the Institute so that they could be intimately observed and recorded across all hours of the day and night. Now, while there were debates about the merits and limitations of studying captive foxes, at this time it was a common ethological approach, as it was assumed such laboratory-like conditions would produce controllable and verifiable data. The following is an excerpt of a typical fox recording recorded from the 30th of June 1953. Individual foxes were given names by Ten Broek, and the description for this recording states the following. Hansel, for the first time, with a fox, here, Fifi, together, whining. On the right is a photograph of Ten Broek with Fifi, and you can see he was very intimate with his foxes. While the 3 archives differ in important ways, one thing they all have to contend with is the need to ensure that recordings are correctly preserved so that they remain accessible in perpetuity. With changes in recording and playback technologies, as well as the ongoing physical deterioration of recordings themselves, this is not an easy task. The types of recording media held within each collection do vary, but the majority are stored on magnetic tape. Indeed, this was the only recording medium used during the production of the WSP's Vancouver recordings, and similarly the ASA's collection up until the advent of digital recording. The British Library's collection, by contrast, contains many different forms of analogue media, but the bulk of it is composed of single-species magnetic tape recordings. Now, when a recordist donated a recording to the collection, the library would make a copy and then archive these copies together. So you can see on this example, on the left-hand side, this is a tape comprised of Dunnock recordings, a small bird common across Europe, and the numerous recordists are listed, so they keep adding more and more recordings as they collate them. Along with the recording, recordists also needed to submit a standardized metadata form, which is here on the right-hand side, again, of a Dunnock metadata form, to ensure that there was contextual information for each recording submitted to the archive. Now, the storage of magnetic tapes varies across the archives. Due to the institutional norms of library storage, only the WES collection at the British Library is stored in a climate-controlled area, where temperature and humidity are continuously monitored and regulated. All 3 of the tape collections, however, have recently undergone time-consuming and very costly digitization processes. Here, magnetic tape recordings have been transferred to lossless digital files. The most recent digitization project occurred at the British Library. This project, called Unlocking Our Sound Heritage, concluded just this year. It was funded by a grant of £9.5 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund, and the project digitized hundreds of thousands of recordings from across the library's holdings, including tens of thousands from the WES collection. These recordings were deemed in some way at risk due to their fragility or because they required increasingly hard-to-find equipment to play them back. When speaking with one of the WES audio cataloguers, they stated that some of the magnetic tape was in such poor condition that they only had one attempt to correctly digitize them, as the tape degraded as the recording was fed through and digitized. Perhaps surprisingly, though, the recordings deemed at most risk within the collection were those stored on rewritable compact discs. These were used primarily in the 1990s and early 2000s, superseding magnetic tapes as a storage media. This form of digital storage was assumed at the time to be a stable form of storage compared to tape. However, it is now apparent that CDRs have a relatively short lifespan, and so it became a race against time to transfer these CDR recordings. It is clear then that there is no final stable archive. Indeed, all three need to be constantly reproduced as a means to preserve them. Now, the digital archive has a really large material footprint, which perhaps runs counter to the rhetorical nebulousness of the digital cloud. Data centers sustaining digital library systems are resource intensive in terms of energy and water, which is used as a coolant, not to mention the human labor involved in their maintenance. The British Library's own digital library is replicated across 5 UK data centres. Now, each of these centres stores a copy of all the digitised recordings, which are then networked with one another. The reason here is that if a file on one server becomes corrupted, then they are restored by the network speaking across these data centres. As a safety measure for such critical infrastructure, the location of one of these centres is unknown, even to Cheryl Tipp. It's a so-called dark spot data centre. By contrast, the World Soundscape Project's digitised recordings are held on an internal server at Simon Fraser University, and the animal sound archives on a single server located within Berlin. Now, Karl-Heinz Frommelt has expressed concern about the ASA's reliance on a single server. There's been a recent spate of hacker attacks on German universities, which has led to the loss of vast amounts of data. And so Karl-Heinz is keenly aware that the ASA digital archive is currently vulnerable. Digitisation offers not only the opportunity to preserve analogue recordings, but also new modes of disseminating them to a variety of listening publics. All recordings held within the ASA and the WSP archives are fully accessible online, and the WES is moving in that direction now that the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project is completed. But there are important caveats here. Firstly, the WES holds a lot of commercially published recordings that cannot be uploaded due to copyright. Secondly, unfettered access to wildlife sound raises ethical issues that need to be carefully considered. Cheryl Tipp provides the following example. She said to me, even regardless of the copyright situation, we have to be very careful of which recordings we give access to, particularly if it's a rare species. So we have recordings of a very rare species of parrot, the Spix macaw, for example. Their populations have shrunk a lot because of the illegal pet trade. Often what they'll do is they'll use the recording, the call of that species, to attract the bird, and then they can capture it. So we have recordings of these parrots, which, looking at the copyright, we've got permission to provide copies for any purpose. So from a law point, I suppose, from a copyright point of view, we can. From an ethical point of view, we can't. Now, unfortunately, a year after this interview was conducted, the Spix macaw was declared extinct in the wild by the IUCN, though there are now ongoing efforts to try and restore the species back to Brazil, where they were endemic. The archive contains other bird species that are now threatened with extinction. Cheryl states that, out of an ethical obligation to their living counterparts, she will not allow access to such recordings. They can only be listened to in the British Library, and copies of them cannot be made. Cheryl has also been contacted by big game hunters, primarily in North America, who want to use recordings as hunting lures. Again, Cheryl has refused these requests. Cheryl has been able to use her ecological knowledge and sensitivity to conservation issues to prevent access where deemed appropriate. This is why Cheryl expressed real concern that sound archives internationally appear to be reducing curatorship roles and are instead focusing on AV specialists to quickly digitize material and make it fully accessible. And this will likely have implications for the potential misuse of wildlife sound recordings. We may understandably assume that, that environmental and wildlife sound archives are full of beautiful, awe-inspiring and uplifting sounds of nature, a sort of therapeutic sonic space befitting the wellness industry. Now, it is certainly true that the archives do hold this kind of material, particularly those recordings that have been published for consumption by the general public. However, to regard environmental and wildlife sound archives as only sources of positive listening experiences does not really adequately capture their richness nor their complexity. David Michael has coined the term dark nature recordings to describe recordings that are aesthetically challenging because of their violent or ugly qualities. He provides the example of a recording by the celebrated sound recordist Chris Watson of vultures eating a zebra carcass from his album Outside the Circle of Fire. Now, what I want to do now for much of the remainder of my talk is provide some examples of recordings and recording practices across the three archives that are in some way challenging or discomforting to listen to. Through doing so, I hope to highlight the knotty ethical and political questions that archiving sonic environments raises. Now, while David Michael focuses on the content of the recordings, I want to demonstrate how the social and ecological contexts of a recording's production and its audition may instill a sense of unease or discomfort. Ostensibly, the WSP's Vancouver project used soundscape-style recordings. What I mean by this is a style of recording where microphones are placed at a distance from sound sources to enable the perception of relative depth and width across a sonic scene. The following is an example from the archive, recorded harbourside in Stanley Park in 1973. There are, however, many examples where the recordists closely mic'd individual sound sources, and so the archive is full of all manner of sounding objects, including cash registers, tea kettles, musical instruments, and a variety of other mechanical sounds. Such spatial proximity creates a relative intimacy between subjects and objects. And so the following example is an example of this style of recording. It's one of the recordists playing a game of pinball from 1972. Wow. Within sound studies, intimacy has been broadly conceived as benign or even something of value. Various scholars, for instance, have argued that listening to radio broadcasts evokes a sense of close connection or togetherness. In the Vancouver archive, intimacy is documented in very audible ways, not only as spatially proximate sound objects that dominate the sonic scene, but also during the numerous times when members of the public get close to and react to the presence of a microphone. This certainly creates a sense of connection or togetherness, though in often quite awkward or otherwise uncomfortable ways. Many such moments are fleeting encounters in which people ask what the recordists are doing.
Excuse me for nosy, but what are you doing?
Some, by contrast, are lively interactions, particularly those involving children.
What's it on for?
Just recording what's happening.
Oh, that's nice. Well, you see what's happening is, just little things.
We scrounged up.
Hey, man, take a walk on the west side.
A number of these recordings, however, are uncomfortable for their non-consensual nature. In the following example, the recordists enter a shop in Chinatown in downtown Vancouver.
Do picture, you know?
Huh?
Do picture, you know?
I'm not taking pictures.
Yeah.
I'm not taking pictures seems to be a common defense from the recordists when entering spaces without prior warning or consent. The implicit argument here is that gathering images would invariably cross some kind of ethical boundary, but audio recordings don't. There are other examples where we hear the recordists state that they are, quote, just working on a research project, working for Simon Fraser University, or even more cryptically for most of the general public, working for R. Murray Schafer. These appeals are clearly insensitive to how the placement of a microphone creates a space charged with power. Such intimate recordings raise complex questions about consent and the assumed publicness of sound, but they leave us in no doubt about the role of the recordist in the translation of sound between the field and the archive. In his recent book titled Listening After Nature, Mark Peter Wright proposes a new term, the noisy non-self. Peter Wright details how the noisy non-self is a means to conceptualize the sound recordist that, quote, lurks in the margins of audibility. Referring to a sound art piece by the artist Fernando Gotti, Peter Wright states the following. Gotti, like many field recordists, wears headphones to monitor sound for technical and aesthetic reasons. As the noisy non-self, he is embroiled in the soundscape, but not necessarily heard as part of its capture. Similar critical readings of wildlife sound recording are to be found in the literature. For example, the science and technology studies scholar Jori Brojnik has discussed how animal sound recordists working across Europe and North America in the early to mid-20th century developed sound recording approaches that sought to produce what Jori describes as, quote, sterile recordings. Here, microphone technologies and techniques were used to ensure that, as far as possible, only the target organism is recorded. Thus, in addition to the silencing of the recordist, there is an attempt to silence other sounds judged to be extraneous. What is striking when listening to the three archives is the sheer volume of recordings that do not align with either Peter Wright's noisy non-self nor this idea of sterile recordings. So we have people speaking back to the recordists in the WSP's Vancouver collection, but also across the three archives there are many moments where we can hear recordists describe events as they unfold, as well as the bodily movements, including clothes rustling and footsteps on various surfaces, the sounds of microphones and recorders being repositioned and generally handled, and other audible cues signifying that we are listening to another person's listening. In many instances, these seemingly small, innocuous moments are the closest thing we have to biographical details about a given recordist, and often reveal much about their approach to recording, as well as the social and environmental context in which they are working. Now, in the case of Gunter Tenbrock's recordings in the Animal Sound Archive, extraneous sounds are everywhere. Partially, this is due, I think, to Tenbrock's recording style. I would suggest, respectfully, that Tenbrock was not an especially skilled recordist. His recordings are full of handling noise sounds and rapid microphone movements, making his presence clearly audible in a manner that detracts from what he is attempting to record. However, the geopolitical context of post-war East Germany is of greater significance to the production of wildlife sounds that are anything but sterile. Tenbrock was unable to travel freely to make recordings outside of East Germany, with only infrequent opportunities to travel to ideologically aligned states. Tenbrock stated the following in a 2004 interview. Due to the ideological pressure of the GDR, we were not able to maintain the advantage that we had of being the first department for behavioral biology in Germany. I was no longer allowed to travel, and in fact, I no longer had any international connections. I only met international scientists when I was invited to Moscow to the academy or university. As I briefly mentioned when introducing the ASA, these travel restrictions influenced Tenbrock's decision to record captive red foxes, but he also sought out other opportunities to record animals away from his institute. Starting in the summer of 1957, Tenbrock began to visit a number of zoos, including Berlin Zoological Gardens, built in 1844, and Tierpark Berlin, which opened in 1955 to cater to East Berliners, as well as a number of other zoos within the GDR. Of his over 7,000 recordings deposited in the ASA, more than 2/3 were recorded at these zoos, and they, alongside the Red Fox recordings, formed the basis of Tenbrock's 1959 publication Animal Voices, the first ever textbook on animal communication anywhere in the world. Tenbrock's zoo recordings are full of the voices and bodily movements of captive leopards, tigers, gorillas, camels, elephants, and other charismatic megafauna. And these voices are interlaced with the architectural acoustics of animal enclosures, the voices of zookeepers and visitors, and his own observational comments committed to tape. These recordings feature interesting moments that reveal more about how humans listen to and respond to captive animals than they do about animal-to-animal communication. Now, by way of example, here is an excerpt of a recording of a juvenile brown bear from 1959, recorded at Berlin Zoological Gardens. The zoo and fox recordings often make for uncomfortable listening, given the confined spaces in which they were recorded, and the ways in which zoo visitors and ethologists interacted with and responded to the animals. Many of the fox recordings were made by using stuffed animals or the playback of fox sounds to provoke often aggressive and territorial responses. We also know from Ten Brock's writings that there were significant issues with the welfare of his foxes. There were, for instance, problems with the quantity and quality of the foxes' diets, echoing human food security issues in the GDR in the 1950s, and many foxes died relatively young from unknown illnesses and other stress factors. Regarding human voices inadvertently recorded within East German zoos, we may assume that people did not give their explicit consent. This is of special significance when we consider the context of GDR surveillance, which made use of the very same audio technologies, such as this UR recorder. And so there is a complex network here of eavesdropping at a variety of different scales. Ten Brock used Agfa tape produced in nearby Wolfen, East Germany. These were intended for export to the USSR, and these tapes were very costly and difficult to access domestically. To kind of counteract this, Ten Brock often reused old tapes from East German radio stations. Some of the archived tapes in the ASA include traces of their former use, such as snippets of music. And so this is an example of such a snippet from a recording of Starlings from 1968. While geopolitical tensions arising from the Cold War significantly shaped the ASA up until the early 1990s, by contrast, the British Library's WES archive was able to rapidly expand through international tape donations and overseas recording expeditions. As with the ASA, this has an important geopolitical context. Reflecting on environmental sound recording approaches used by contemporary Anglo-European artists working in settler colonies and formerly colonized places, Kangisa describes the influence of what they term sonic colonialities. They say the following: sonic colonialities are structures of listening and sense-making that are founded on and reinforce Anglo-European onto-epistemologies of humans in relation to and distinct from nature. While Peter Wright's noisy non-self focuses on the inaudibility of the recordist and Breunig the removal of non-target organisms, Kangisa is concerned here with the silencing of indigenous and local communities as a means to record the non-human world, apparently devoid of human habitation. In the WES archive, this silencing is achieved not only through the careful avoidance of indigenous voices when recording, but also by recording in landscapes that have undergone the forced removal of people. A significant amount of work undertaken at the WES in the 1970s and 1980s went into the production of a series of biogeographical wildlife discographies. Jeffrey Boswell worked with Ron Kettle, the WES curator, during this time, to produce a comprehensive list of all known published and privately held species recordings from a given region. These were printed in the Sound Archive's in-house journal, Recorded Sound. In 1975, they published a discography of bird sound from the Ethiopian zoogeographical region, which covers all of Africa south of the Sahara. These discographies were compiled through extensive letter writing between Boswell and sound recordists, requesting the submission of recordings and complementary metadata. Now, this version of the African discography was an updated version of one produced in 1967 by Boswell and Miles North. North was a prodigious sound recordist of birds in East Africa, a portion of which he published across these two LPs, Voices of African Birds and More Voices of African Birds, in 1958 and 64 respectively. Based in Nairobi, Kenya, Miles helped Jeffrey and Ron update the earlier version and was instrumental in creating and maintaining networks of recordists between Africa, the US and the UK. After having spent a short period of time in the British Army, North worked for the British Colonial Administrative Service in Kenya, serving for a time as a district commissioner. His status as a British colonial official permitted North to travel and record freely. In an article published in Recorded Sound in 1969, North describes his recording techniques in East Africa on various recording expeditions with other European and North American ornithologists and recordists, and mentions how the warden of Tsavo National Park in Kenya, quote, gave me free run of the park. Because of his power as a colonial official, he was also free to use whatever means he had at his disposal to make recordings. In a 1965 letter, shown here, from North to Boswell, he describes how a hunter friend shot and skinned a zebra. The carcass was then used to lure feeding vultures so that they could be recorded. He does note, however, with some frustration, that during 6 hours of waiting with microphones in position, only one hooded vulture came to the zebra and it didn't feed. This approach strikingly echoes Chris Watson's Dark Nature recording, though I do hasten to add that Chris did not kill a zebra in the making of his recording. Another recordist at this time was Tony Pooley, a South African naturalist and conservationist who worked as a senior ranger at Ndumu Game Reserve, which is located in the northeast of South Africa near the Mozambique border. Tony made a series of bird recordings while working on the reserve, which are listed in the discography. Now, the reserve, where he worked and recorded, was created in the following way. In 1924, a large portion of western Maputo land was declared a protected area by the South African government. By the 1960s, Ndumu Game Reserve, as it became known, had been cleared of all of its inhabitants and duly refashioned into a pristine natural wilderness, forcing men to migrate to the cities to seek wage labour and confining women to fixed tracts of land on the periphery of the park on which their survival became increasingly dependent. Now, to identify Pooley's recordings as an outcome of conservation via disposition, it is to acknowledge the structural injustices that made the archive's rapid expansion possible and the social trauma and landscape enclosures that facilitated many wildlife recordings. Importantly, this context is not provided in any of the recording's metadata. These are just two examples of countless sonic colonialities to be found in this archive, which range in scale and intensity, from forced evictions to recordists' ignorance of local names for places and species, to the complete silencing of local guides and trackers that so often made the recording of endemic species possible. Now, I want to finish by turning to consider the contemporary relevance of these sound archives in relation to current environmental crises. I'll demonstrate here how each of the archives are finding new roles in the 21st century as we enter a period of rapid environmental change. New iterations of the World Soundscape Project's Vancouver recordings were made in the early to mid-1990s, and then again in 2010 to 2011 by two postgraduate students working with Barry Truax. There was a concerted effort to re-record in some of the same locations from the first version of the project as a means to understand how Vancouver's soundscape has changed or not through time. It is now possible on the WSP website to make side-by-side comparisons between these different timeframes. Indeed, the original archive was set up in such a way that it encouraged a listener to experience soundscape change through time, with the inclusion of historical written accounts detailing how pre-colonial Vancouver may have sounded. There is an overarching narrative to be found within the archive, and certainly the writings of R. Murray Schafer, that Vancouver, as heard in the mid to late 20th century, was on an unstoppable trajectory towards a cacophonous future. During my own time in Vancouver a few years back, I also attempted to retrace the itinerary of the 1970s Vancouver project and produce another temporal layer of recordings. When comparing at a rather general level the recordings from the 1970s to my own, it is possible to sonically trace a decline in heavy manufacturing and an associated expansion of urban green spaces, which now nestle amongst the city's overheated property market. In short, and perhaps rather crudely, it is possible to detect a relative quietening across time as a result of deindustrialization and inner-city gentrification. While the Vancouver collection was resolutely focused on listening to urban soundscape change, the WES and the ASA are, by contrast, now addressing the issue of biodiversity loss in two quite distinct ways. Firstly, through species memorialization, and secondly, through species monitoring. As we've already heard, the voice of threatened species features within the WES, but there are also species that are now extinct. These recordings serve as one of the last representations of living creatures no longer present. On playback and understood within the context of species loss, they are somber in character. This is accentuated when the voice in question seems to contain mournful or haunting qualities. An example from the WES is a recording of the Kauai-o'o, a small songbird once endemic to Kauai in Hawaii. This recording was made in 1983 by the conservationist John Sincock. The bird was declared extinct in 2000 due to habitat loss and the introduction of black rats to the island. The British Library contextualizes the recording in the following manner. The recording captures the song of the last known o'o bird in existence. He was a part of the last mating pair, but the year before had lost his mate during Hurricane Iwa. And I'm going to play you the recording now. So that's the last known o'o bird calling and getting no response because it's the last in existence. Cheryl Tipp said the following about this recording: "Nothing can ever replace an extinct species, yet being able to hear the sounds of animals that once shared our planet can be the most potent and evocative way of reconnecting ourselves with these lost voices. In these situations, sound recordings become acoustic relics of something precious that will never return. Sound archives act as the final protectors of expired voices and have a core role in preserving the memory of our biophonic past." Now, while the WES is recomposed as a space for the memorialization of extinction, the ASA now has an active role in species conservation that was not part of Ten Brock's original bioacoustics research. While Ten Brock wanted to collate animal voices in the archive to investigate animal communication, Dr. Karl-Heinz Frommelt has developed a research interest in the application of bioacoustics techniques for the purposes of conservation monitoring. Increasingly, Dr. Frommelt is using automated recording systems that do not require a recordist to be present. Such systems are being used for at least two forms of species monitoring. Firstly, through installing a number of recording devices, the location of ground nesting birds can be estimated. Dr. Frommelt is currently conducting research to locate the presence of corncrakes, which are facing population pressures due to farming machinery that destroys their nests. Now, corncrakes, for those that don't know, are ground nesting birds. Secondly, these automated recording systems, which can record continuously over long durations, allow researchers to monitor ecosystem changes in terms of species composition, and this has come to be known as ecoacoustics. Historical sounds already held within the collection are being used to train neural networks. So-called reference animal vocalizations, which are high-quality individual species recordings, are the basis for this algorithmic work. So, for example, reference corncrake vocalizations train algorithms to identify their distinct vocal pattern. Once this is completed, algorithms can automatically detect and log every instance of a corncrake across hours of recordings. Okay. So mine and Sandra Jasper's research on the ASA and WES archives continues as we work our way through a rather intimidating amount of archival materials. I hope that what I've outlined this afternoon gives you a sense of the kinds of questions we can ask of wildlife and environmental sound archives. These are, I think, fascinating but underused resources for interrogating people's relationships with the sounds of landscapes and the natural world. Thank you for listening.